Hey everyone, welcome to another G News podcast. Today we are very lucky to be joined by Chloe Swarbrick, co-leader of the Green Party. Hey Chloe, welcome to G News.
Thank you so much for having me. Stoked to be here.
Oh, you're totally welcome. Let's talk about the energy crisis. And first of all, let's just talk about this whole Iran conflict and how it got started and New Zealand's position on that. Today we heard that the director of the US National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, had said that Iran was not enriching its nuclear capabilities, and this was something that it had not done since the attacks by Israel and the US last year. This was the view of the entire intelligence community in the United States. Christopher Luxon has refused to go back and say, restate his position on this. Do you think he should go back and restate it? And what's your view on New Zealand's position?
I guess first things first, politicians should always be willing to look in the mirror and confront when they've been wrong and to apologise for doing so and then to correct the record. That's basically, I think, one of the key things that people should expect of their elected representatives, to just be honest and to confront the truth and the reality of the world. With regard to our position and the position that this government has taken on the war on Iran, I don't really have words for it, honestly, Jared. It's gutting, it's cowardice, it is out of line with international law. When the strikes initially occurred, I think actually, just to pause and rewind, it is possible to hold two truths. It is possible to understand that Iran's regime is oppressive, has instituted a heck of a lot of political violence. You know, we as the Greens were quite heavily involved several years ago with the Women Life Freedom movement, and I personally have also sponsored Tamar Shalehi, who was a rapper who was imprisoned by the regime. We can recognise that the regime is oppressive and is not in line with human rights, but we can simultaneously recognise that the strikes that were undertaken by the United States and by Israel were illegal under international law. And I don't think that it should be crazy to expect that, particularly as a small island nation in the Pacific that relies on upholding international law for our own safety, let alone for our own integrity and that truth and honesty that I was talking about before, that we should expect that people who hold themselves out as leaders of this country have the spine, if I may, to just acknowledge that truth, that these strikes were illegal and that therefore the ongoing war effort is illegal.
Yeah. The growing energy crisis in New Zealand now has absolutely highlighted our dependency on fossil fuels, and there's been a recent surge in demand for EVs.
Yep.
Could you step us through the record of this government's decisions that have made us increasingly dependent and vulnerable on to the supply of fossil fuels, and the kind of energy shocks that we're now going through?
Yeah, I can pick quite a few out of thin air for you. So one of them that I would point to is the cancellation of the clean car discount. So the clean car discount was obviously operationalised under the former government, and it helped to subsidise people getting their own electric vehicles. As of 2023, prior to the election, it was 23 or 24% of all car sales were electric vehicles. In 2025, last year, 2 years after the Luxon government came in and cut that, it was 8% of all car sales. So you can see it's just dropped off of a cliff at a point in time where we actually should be building that resilience, which is reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. So that's one, just in the personal vehicle space. Simultaneously, they obviously have hiked up public transport fares, which has then meant more people are dependent on private vehicles, especially, if I talk to tertiary students, university students in town, they'll tell me that now it's just unaffordable for them to get to uni. So they're either driving their vehicles in there, which in turn is adding to congestion and climate changing emissions, or they're just not going. Then if you look at, for example, the decision of the government in May 2025 budget to hand out $200 million in taxpayer-funded subsidies to new fossil fuel production. This one is insane for a number of reasons. When Shane Jones first started talking about it back in November, December 2024, I actually wrote to Prime Minister Luxon and said, hey, look, if you guys are considering doing this is not only bonkers economically in terms of the displacement of money that would otherwise be invested in renewable energy and the crowding out of that. It also doesn't make sense from a climate perspective if we're to try and meet the goals that you say that you're committed to. But on top of all of that, it is likely to be in breach of our free trade agreements. True to form, we didn't get a response from the Prime Minister. So we then saw it represented in the May 2025 budget. For the uninitiated, as a member of the opposition, you get to go into what's called budget lockup an hour before the budget is tabled and released in Parliament. So we're in there about 1 p.m. before the 2 p.m. table and release. And just going through stacks and stacks of pages. And I spotted in there this $200 million subsidy for the first time. And there's all these officials from Treasury in the room. And I just started asking them, hey, has anyone done due diligence on this to understand the impact on our FTAs, our free trade agreements, namely the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, or our EU and UK FTAs, whereby we're not allowed to subsidise fossil fuel production because that is considered a downgrading of our environmental and climate efforts. No one can answer in the room, and they actually got someone on Treasury on the phone for me, and then someone from MFAT, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. No one knew that either. So subsequently went out of the room, kind of made the point to media that it seemed as though the government hadn't done its due diligence, and then so on and so forth, kind of pressed the issue both in select committee hearings and also in question time with the Prime Minister, where of course he dances around on the head of a pin, not answering the question. And then it transpires that the government hadn't done any due diligence, and we had to get our own independent expert King's Counsel to demonstrate that it was in breach of our FTAs. So then we took that to the government and said, we did the work because clearly you didn't. And they said, no, that's not true. That's not reality. And don't worry, no one's raised it with us. So then we got somebody in the UK to do what's called an FOIA, the equivalent of an OIA request in the UK, to show that in fact, UK equivalents for the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Climate Change have in fact raised directly with our Minister of Foreign Affairs, our Minister of Climate Change, and our ministry officials that they are concerned that this is potentially in breach of our free trade agreements. And this from the supposed economic managers of our time, So I guess the point that I'm trying to make to you, Gerard, is not only is this government actively undermining efforts to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees as necessary for life on Earth as we know it, they are also undermining our economic resilience and also undermining our reputation on the international stage, which comes at the cost and the expense of the very farmers and growers that they say that they are doing this for. And then I guess the cherry on top of all of that, which people will be quite familiar with because it has dominated the news headlines a lot at the start of this year, is the utterly bonkers decision when Prime Minister Christopher Luxon came out and proudly announced that he would be increasing everybody's power bills to pay for in excess of $1 billion worth of a new LNG import terminal. And he says that this again is about ensuring us against fuel and supply shocks. There was not one economist, not one expert who came out in support of it. In fact, all of them saying exactly the opposite, that this is a guaranteed extra cost for no guaranteed benefit at all, is a hope and a wish. In fact, increasing our dependence on fossil fuels, which was obviously demonstrated to be utter ludicrousy, utter insanity in the context of the economic and fuel supply shocks that we're now seeing as a result of the war in Iran. And this is where, again, just really basic economic management would look at return on investment. And if you want to reduce people's power bills, let alone the impact on the planet, then you would be investing in resilient, diversified, renewable energy.
Exactly. So here we all are, the price of petrol's going up and the government's had a couple of weeks now. What do you make of their response to the situation we find ourselves in?
Utterly dismal, to be honest with you. Responsible government doesn't wait for shit to hit the fan until it actually does something. There are efforts that we can be making right now to improve our resilience, which will have benefits well into the future, even if it does end up occurring that this conflict stops. At some point, in the next few weeks. If it is protracted, however, it makes sense for us to be investing that resilience. Again, regardless of whatever happens, we need to invest in our resilience. And you don't need to wait for the crisis to continue to escalate to worse and worse heights for us to do so. So the government could be doing a number of things, the likes of changing its tune on the clean car discount, for example, to get as many of those EVs as possible on the roads as alternatives to our private, petrol vehicles, but also investing in subsidising public transport, which means, I understand that obviously disproportionately benefits people in cities, but that frees up supply for those in rural areas. Funnily enough, I do actually agree with the Minister of Finance when she says that a fuel tax cut could be regressive and doesn't actually deal with the supply issues. However, I wish that she would apply that logic to everything that she does, because the government's done a heck of a lot of really regressive things in the economic and particularly the tax space, where we know that their trickle-down tax cuts, when they first came in, for example, disproportionately benefited the wealthiest people in this country. I believe 60% of the benefit was captured by around 40 or 30% of those at the top. Anyway, better use of money would look like direct support for low and middle income New Zealanders. And, we have precedent with direct payments of this type, obviously through the likes of COVID-19. But I think the bigger point is right now, we need to be actively and quickly unhooking our energy supply system from fossil fuels, because that's where the vulnerability exists in the supply chain. And as it transpires, there's a heck of a lot of solar panels sitting in China right now, and China's not particularly happy with the United States as a result of the tariffs that have been slapped on. Those solar panels don't need to come through the Strait of Hormuz, and our government could be investing in getting as many of them as quickly to this country, slapping them on public buildings, rapidly decarbonising, and ensuring that we had diversified renewable energy out to all of our community members.
Awesome. Well, we started 2026 with some extreme weather events. And we have been dragging the chain on resilience work. There's been all sorts of delays. There's been these disaster funds that have been mostly reprioritised, leaving many, many people now in terrible situations. So we know that this is only going to get worse. So what should we be doing to get on and solve that problem?
Yeah, so I guess useful to kind of, again, take a step back and define what we're talking about. So when we're talking about climate action, we're usually talking about one of two things, and oftentimes there is an interface between the two. So we're talking about climate mitigation, which is rapidly reducing our climate changing emissions, so reducing the warming impact on the planet. And the other kettle is climate adaptation. So that is recognising that the planet has already warmed to a certain extent, therefore we are already living in a time of more extreme and frequent weather events. So I think that good climate action actually marries both of those two things. And there's some really good examples of this with, for example, renewable energy. Not only is that decarbonising, so, not producing the same kind of climate changing emissions into the atmosphere, but it also means that we are more resilient when those extreme weather events do hit, especially if it's diversified in terms of where it's actually deployed around the country on marae and schools and public buildings and private buildings and otherwise. So again, this government came in and just slashed merciless cuts all across the board. And one of the areas that has been raised a lot is the Climate Emergency Response Fund, where they cut $6 billion, which actually, it's important for people to understand, was raised through something called the Emissions Trading Scheme. That's not a generalised tax pool. That comes from our biggest polluters. So it's our biggest polluters who were, at that point in time, effectively paying for decarbonisation and climate adaptation for communities. That was a fund that often coupled with local government and their efforts for cycle lanes and electrification of bus fleets and all of those other really cool and awesome things, more wetlands and all of those kinds of things. So again, we could be looking at simply redeploying a package akin to that. We could be looking at, again, just the kind of easiest and most convenient things to decarbonise our transport fleet in terms of rapid transit networks. That doesn't always need to look like immediately going to, as much as I love trains, investing in that big infrastructure like trains. It can look like how we get more frequent services available to get people out of their cars and also make those things more affordable.
Our international climate obligations include something called the Nationally Determined Contributions, about which Nicola Willis has said we're not sending billions overseas. Could you outline to us all in straight up terms what this is all about?
Okay, so we are signed up to something called the Paris Agreement, as are 190 odd other member countries of the United Nations. The Paris Agreement was basically the commitments that all of these member states of the UN said, hey, look, this is going to require global effort for us to reduce climate changing emissions internationally, because it turns out that a warming planet doesn't actually care about where those emissions come from. So we all need to agree to do our part. The way that everybody's part was calculated is through something called nationally determined contributions. So that means that obviously the size of your country, that being geographically as well as your population, but also the wealth of your country and the historical benefit that your country has reaped from particularly carbon intensive industry is all kind of taken into account, right? So we currently have a government that's saying that they are going to meet our nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement out till 2030. What that means, based on a report from the Ministry for the Environment and Treasury back in 2023, they said back in 2023, which bear in mind is before a change of government, that if we are to meet our NDCs, and this is under the former government, before this lot came in, we were going to have to, because of how much successive governments had dragged their chain, pay for something called offshore mitigation, that is for other countries to reduce their emissions because of the lack of historical effort here, at the very least a minimum of, I believe, $2.4 billion, and that was back in 2022, 2023. But they said that that cost could escalate up to $24 billion if there were to be more cuts to domestic climate action because of the offshore mitigation that is necessary to fill that gap to meet our nationally determined contributions out to 2023 under the Paris Agreement. So we now have a government that has come to power, slashed dozens and dozens of pieces of climate action, be they in the mitigation that we've been talking about a lot, but also in terms of the adaptation. And actually, I should also mention on this point of adaptation, the government frequently cites that they are supporting our farmers to transition towards more sustainable methods of agriculture. We exposed that the government actually re-announced a package which our former government that we had been a part of had come up with and fully funded. This government re-announced that fund after cutting $50 million from it. Same goes with their only discernible climate adaptation policy, which is for flood protection, which they've cut 3/4 of funding from. And again, on that point that you were making before around climate adaptation, you know, James Shaw, as climate minister, had produced a draft plan of approximately 200 pages. What Simon Watts has presented is, I think, 2 to 4 pages, more of a pamphlet than a plan. But anyway, back to the NDCs. So under the NDC, you cannot simultaneously say that we are going to meet our nationally determined contribution out to 2023, but also, as the Minister of Finance continues to say, as is the Prime Minister and the Minister of Climate Change, we're not going to pay other countries. The maths don't math. It's simply incomputable. So we're left with the reality that if we are to meet these NDCs, then we are going to have to pay for offshore mitigation, and the reality that every time the government undermines domestic climate action, we are on the hook to pay billions of dollars more to other countries to reduce their emissions. So again, we come back to this basic point that not only are they, and I'm kind of loath to say that they're illiterate. In some ways, I think that they actually understand this stuff and they're just really arrogant and hoping to pull the wool over New Zealanders' eyes. But therefore, they are, you just cannot uphold any notion in any world that they are good economic managers, because they're not only undermining the well-being and the welfare of New Zealanders right now, but are rapidly making decisions to degrade it into the future.
40 or 50 years ago, our parents and grandparents could afford to actually buy a house if they worked hard. In fact, they could buy 1 or 2, maybe they could buy 3. But that's not true anymore today. In fact, only a very small number of people can afford to do this anymore. So if we don't do something, we've heard that what's going to actually end up happening when it comes to wealth inequality is that our children and grandchildren will end up being poor, and the people that actually have the assets will actually own all the assets, and we won't be able to compete with them, or our children won't. The Green Party have a solution to wealth inequality. Could you please explain it to us?
For sure. And I'd like to also do my classic thing of going, let's look at the context, because you absolutely have outlined it perfectly in terms of how house prices are one of the kind of canaries in the coal mine for this wealth inequality, whereby we are seeing, regular hardworking people who are in, a partnership where both of them are earning decent money, who are unable to purchase a house. Whereas back in the day, you could work in the post office as, one earning person in a partnership of 2 with multiple kids, and you could make it work. And this is where it's important for people to understand that when we're talking about wealth inequality and any tolerance of wealth inequality, we're also talking about greater tolerance of the degradation of democracy. Because as people's lives become more and more precarious and therefore more and more unstable, it is really difficult for people to have the time and the energy and the space to participate in understanding the evidence and the research and the information to participate in democratic discussions, and understandably become all the more frustrated and therefore potentially more vulnerable to the messages of radicalized right-wing politicians who are trying to blame certain minority groups because that's the simplest pathway. So we're seeing this obviously happen right now internationally, namely particularly in the UK, where obviously reform is surging above the Labour Party there, which again I think is indicative of how tepid centrist politics is a breeding ground for right-wing radicalism. But we're also seeing an amazing fight being put up by the Greens over there because they are marrying this cost of living message with climate action. So in Aotearoa, we have a phenomenal piece of research from, again, 2022-2023, facilitated by the Inland Revenue Department called the High Wealth Individuals Report. And what this did was look at the wealthiest 311 households in this country and found that of those 311 households, they had an average wealth of approximately $276 million each. So, that's just for people to really understand the kind of wealth we're talking about here. And together combined, I believe that they had about $84 to $86 billion worth of wealth. That was at that point in time more wealth than the bottom 2.5 million New Zealanders combined. This is an important point because there we're talking about in 2023, 311 households, approximately $84 billion. We know as of the NBR Rich List last year that the wealthiest 110 odd individuals are worth in excess of $100 billion. Wow. So you can see that there's been a reduction in the size of people that we're talking about, but a massive increase in that wealth held by those at the top. Again, difficult because kind of apples and pears, but it does give you an indication of how much worse things have got over the last few years because it's been unattended to, and obviously also the trickle-down tax cuts from this government. So what that report also showed is not only the stratification of wealth and how those at the top own an exorbitant amount of the wealth in this country, but it told us why. And the reason is that this is not an accident, but it's a consequence of a tax system that sees those at the top pay half the effective tax rate of the average New Zealander. So we're talking about people with an average wealth in excess of $276 million who are paying half the effective tax rate of firefighters, nurses, teachers, hairdressers, you and me, the person who delivers the post. We're talking about something which is not only so profoundly unfair in terms of people's capability to pay, but just that basic equity point, but also a status quo that robs us of the resources necessary to invest in the kind of country that everybody deserves. And this is the other point about the degradation of democracy, right? Is as we're seeing resources being pulled out of our education system or out of healthcare, et cetera, our society becomes all the more fractious, people become all the more stressed and all the more angry towards each other. It's not a recipe for a healthy, let alone productive, let alone happy society. So the proposals that we've put on the table, which have been, slandered from every which direction, are actually in line with what the international best research and evidence denotes as the best way to actually deal with and tackle these things, which is a wealth tax. And in both 2020 and 2023, we ran on a wealth tax, and probably won't surprise anyone, we may be doing that again, but it might be changed somewhat. But what we ran on in 2023, noting this is our 23 policy, was a wealth tax for the top 3% of society, which in turn would unlock a tax cut, an income tax cut for the bottom 91%, the vast majority of New Zealanders, and also enable us to pay for free GPs, free early childhood education, free dentistry, to build 40,000 public homes, which could help us to end homelessness, to again massively invest back in our education system. Just all of the things that would mean that we are a healthier, happier, and more functional society. And I find it really interesting when we hear from those who oppose this, that, and I'm sure we'll get into all of the different arguments, but the main argument seems to be this one that it's just impossible to do. I'd invite those people to go back to look at the Parliamentary Hansard, the record of debates that we have in the chamber, back when effectively PAYE was introduced. And the arguments were exactly the same, that it would be impossible for us to quantify this stuff. People would obscure things. And guess what? We just went ahead with it. We instituted that this was the principle that we would follow, and now we have the income tax system in the way that it is. No one's pretending that it's not going to be difficult, but we do have to start. We actually have to do things if we want to move society forward.
I find it really hard to understand why the majority of New Zealanders don't want massive tax relief right now by shifting the tax burden away from, say, that first 10,000, you know, and giving everybody under 120K much less tax to pay, so they can afford these massive increases in power bills and groceries and the petrol increases.
Let alone basic public services, right? I mean, that's the thing about ensuring that any functional society has a floor where we say, you are going to get access to healthcare, to education and to housing, because we understand that these are basic dignities necessary.
Who doesn't want free dental care? You know, who doesn't want the ability to catch a train or a plane, you know, to get around by public transport for free for people that are under 12 or half price for people up to 24? I mean, it's kind of bonkers that labeling people Marxists or, you know, saying, oh, ha, 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 you know, what do the Greens know, ends up being a barrier to what would actually help the vast majority of New Zealanders. And this whole idea that if we don't do something to fix it, we are going to get worse and worse and worse off. So when are we going to start listening?
Well, I think that's what we can see in the last 40 years. You know, we've been sold this lie since before I was born, that if we just cut the taxes at the top, then apparently that's going to stimulate some kind of investment in regular hardworking people and job creation or whatever. But what we've actually seen over the last 40 years is that, yeah, we actually do have our country is bigger in terms of GDP. We have more wealth than we have ever had. The problem is that that is not distributed fairly. So while our country is richer than it has ever been, we have amongst the highest rates of child poverty, the highest rates of homelessness. Our rivers and our soil is poisoned. And we kind of just have to take a second and go, what is the point of this thing called the economy? Because we don't live in a game of monopoly. We can and should change the rules when they don't work for the majority of us. And in fact, one of the funniest or saddest things about all of this is I was once making this point in a debate in Parliament, and Simeon Brown was heckling at me. And I just kind of, I was making the point about monopoly. And monopoly was invented by a woman called Lizzie McGee in the early 1900s before she was ripped off by Hasbro. And it was originally called the landlord's game. And it was intended to teach children about the pitfalls of an economy that is premised on land speculation and luck. To teach children that. And I just find it so profoundly, I mean, ironic's not even the right word. Again, we're at a loss for words for how insane these rules of society are at the moment. But it's mind-blowing that we are doing the thing that we were warned against, and we've also witnessed our world and our society deteriorate before our very eyes as a result, clearly, of the rules that we have in place. Yet we're still somehow, by the vast majority, as you alluded to, upholding the story that somehow things are just going to magically get better despite 40 years of evidence that it's deteriorating.
Yeah. So one of these objections that are often used, and I can almost hear people in the audience mumbling, is capital flight. People, the rich will leave. The rich will bugger off somewhere in the world. I don't know where, some mall in the Middle East now, probably being bombed, I guess. But as you say, this whole fair share thing of paying your taxes, is capital flight a good enough argument to actually stop the vast majority of New Zealanders actually having a crack and their children and grandchildren at a better life?
Absolutely not. So I actually spoke to Thomas Piketty, who wrote the book, which is a play on Marx's Capital, which was the kind of lodestar that started all of this debate over the past decade, by which he showed that we have inequality that is starting to rival effectively the aristocratic periods, which we all know how that ended, right? And this is what I think people also need to understand, is that society will continue to degrade if we allow the middle class effectively to disappear. And that's the other point, is that this isn't a left versus right thing anymore. This is a 99% versus the 1%. This is we actually get to decide the rules because we are the vast majority of people. And if there are a tiny, tiny minority who are exploiting you and laughing their way to the bank doing so. Sorry, why would we listen to them about what's possible within society? We live in a democracy. So back to your core question of kind of capital flight. Yeah, spoke to Piketty about this, and he made the point that there's a number of different interventions that we can make. One would be effectively an exit tax, which is similar, that exists in many other jurisdictions. So if people do try and up their money and run, then there is a cost for doing so, which means effectively they do get taxed on that wealth. But secondly, and again, this is what all of the international research shows, wealthy people aren't living in places simply because they're tax havens. They tend to be because they are interested in a quality of life and they have a community around them, and there's an identity associated to that and all of those other things. And sure, while there may be a few outliers akin to Elon Musk or whatever who want to go and live on Mars, that's not the case for the majority of regular people. So it is going to require some international coordination, and we can see that there are a number of jurisdictions who are starting to wake up to this reality as well. So yeah, I guess the first argument would be we can institute an exit tax. The second would be that people actually want to live in communities and in countries that are relatively stable, and doing so means that everybody does need to pay their fair share. And the third is that it's actually impossible to just completely suck all of this money out and run.
53.8% of debt to GDP. That's kind of like where the Greens had arrived at in their fiscal update when it came to what we could do if we wanted to say that the economy can be redesigned and redesign it and fix these problems. Does that level of debt mean that we can't have enough headroom to fix future shocks, or is that being overstated?
Yes, I'm so glad you raised this. So one of the really important things to understand about the rhetoric that we hear around debt, particularly government debt, is that a government is not a household. A government is the entity that can borrow for the cheapest in the economy, far cheaper than any household, far cheaper than any business. And when we're talking about borrowing, that is a government taking on debt, we should be asking ourselves what the government is taking on debt for. So what the Greens have proposed in our fiscal strategy is actually far more economically and evidentially sound than what our current Minister of Finance, the supposed good economic manager, is doing. Nicola Willis borrowed to fund billions of dollars worth of tax cuts. That has produced precisely no more productive capacity in our economy. It has produced no new jobs, and it has just effectively been sucking money in the form of debt that the government now has to pay back in order to cut, or to have foregone revenue. What the Greens have proposed is that we would use debt productively to fund the capital expenditure necessary to rebuild our infrastructure and our hospitals and our schools, which in turn would mean the creation of more jobs, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of, I guess, the first and most important thing to understand. Related to that, Nicola Willis likes to talk a lot about how she met with credit ratings agencies, and therefore, she's the person who you should listen to when she's talking about how higher debt means that we'll be having higher repayment costs. I also went and met with credit ratings agencies when I was in the UK because I was intrigued with whatever it was that she may have learnt from them. And what I learnt from them is, funnily enough, exactly what validated our understanding, having spoken to many domestic experts, which is that what those credit ratings agencies are actually looking at is the credibility of government spending plans. And a credit rating agency is not going to downgrade us because we are investing actively in increasing our resilience as an economy. And I guess the most kind of classic metaphor I can arrive to on this point is, if we're saving for a rainy day, why the hell would we not also buy an umbrella? If we can make the investment necessary to reduce the impact of entirely foreseeable shocks and events. So the rationale that we often hear from Treasury around keeping our debt low, and also from Willis, is that it's all about saving for that rainy day. But again, if we know that we are faced with more extreme and severe weather events, then we should be investing in that climate adaptation that we were talking about before. That reduces the cost of those events when they do occur. Same goes with earthquake strengthening, and also actually investing in education, if we're talking about, the potential shock of AI, and so on and so forth. So funnily enough, for all of the critique that was lobbied at us in terms, and it was always ad hominem, just utter nonsense. Like, no one wants to actually engage with us in the argument, which probably tells you everything that you need to know. But for all of the name calling that occurred, what they were talking about when they were talking about our so-called clown economics is a difference, I believe, projected out to 2029 of about 9% of debt, which, in the context of, I think it was ours is around 54, the government's was around 45. The difference in that world is that we have a far more sustainable, far more equitable, far fairer, far happier, far more environmentally aligned Aotearoa New Zealand that we can be proud of, that people are not leaving to the tune of 200 plus every single day. And I guess, again, this is where I come back to the basic point of what kind of world do we want to live in, and why are we constraining ourselves by arbitrary rules that don't even stack up against their own orthodox logic?
Exactly. And I think, New Zealanders need to start to listen. They're probably already stressed out trying to pay the bills, like you said, about democracy. But they need to kind of tune in on this because it's in their own interests to have a slightly better standard of living
The
here.
government's relying on people being tuned out. The government's relying on people being,
taking up slogans like tax, borrow, and spend, or,
which
when in
ironically
fact
is what Willis is doing.
Yeah. So recently we heard Paul Goldsmith and his crew have ignored official advice again. This time from two agencies that move on orders for our homeless people would probably cause more harm, actually, and they said don't do it. But Goldsmith's ignored that advice and is going to do it anyway. They even said something along the lines of making, let's consider making it a criminal offence to intimidate people by begging, just by sitting there needing food and asking for help. They didn't do that, but they came pretty close to it. Could you talk about why moving on the homeless is absolutely not solving anything, and whether Christopher Luxon has finally taken up your invitation over a year or so ago now to come and have a look and meet the children and people that are living homeless in Auckland?
I'll start at that point. No, he has not. I remember asking him, so it was in September 2024 when the government's changes around access to emergency housing came into effect, when we saw almost overnight a rapid and very visible increase in homelessness. And the change was that people had to prove that they had not contributed to their own homelessness. How long's a piece of string, right? And what we've seen off the back of that is that decline rates for emergency housing, which, by the way, we've never said is the be-all end-all solution. Emergency housing is the immediate urgent response to somebody otherwise sleeping on the street. You need to build up a pipeline to having safe, secure, stable and affordable housing for people so they're not staying in emergency housing. And we're on the record critiquing, our former government partners, Labour, on this point, that you cannot just leave people in emergency housing. So that's the most important point there. When those changes came into effect, we saw an increase from a 4% decline rate to a 34% decline rate pretty rapidly. And that is obviously immediately causative to the growing homelessness that we're not only seeing now represented in a doubling of homelessness figures in Tamaki Makaurau, but in many other cities and increasingly in rural Aotearoa. So I said to the Prime Minister almost off the bat when those changes were coming into effect, because we knew, and again, experts, community leaders, social service providers all warned them at that point in time in 2024 that those changes were going to result in more homelessness. They went ahead with it anyway, and we saw more homelessness. I don't know what you can read from that other than the government intentionally increased homelessness. I asked the Prime Minister to meet the people, including the children who he had made homeless, and he said at the time that he would check in the context of his diary. So I have sent him a follow-up letter and then kind of hammered that point in question time multiple times, to which, he then just completely sidestepped the question and has been unwilling to engage in the consequences, I guess, of his actions. So now, in response to the consequences of the government's actions, by which there is very clearly a growing homeless population, they have decided that they are going to institute these so-called move-on orders. So to answer the core of that question, move on to where? That's really it. You're not solving a problem if you're pushing it out of sight and supposedly out of mind. You're actually making it somebody else's problem. And with the criminalisation backstop that will exist in this legislation, the government is actually also knowingly, per the advice that you're alluding to, creating a pipeline from the street into the prison system. That costs $200,000 per prisoner per year for, based on Te Ruki, the Safe and Effective Justice Review, chaired by the late great Chester Burrows, who was a former police officer, and then Minister of Police under the National Party. We know that the criminal justice system costs an exorbitant amount of money and often results in worse and worse outcomes. So for all of the social investment talk that we hear from the Minister of Finance, let alone efficient use of resources and otherwise, we know that investing early and getting people off the street and providing them wraparound support, the support to get into education or employment, as opposed to just punishing them and punching down on them, results not only in happier, healthier people, but also saves us all money in the long run. So even if you're not a bleeding heart liberal or lefty or progressive or whatever you want to call yourself, this should be an argument that appeals to the most hard nut to crack right-wing economic thinker, which really leaves me with the conclusion that this isn't a decision based on economics or fiscals for the government. It really is one grounded on values, and the values that they are showing us is that they do not care about the most vulnerable and structurally marginalised New Zealanders.
Finally, going into the election this year, do you have any messages that you would like to say to all the voters out there?
Don't leave politics to the politicians, or we'll get what we've always got. And I mean it really seriously. Like, I have the privilege of going and talking to, school kids and, schools across the electorate and across the country. And I always am so inspired when I just ask them, and the kids have such moral clarity. You go, what would you do if you were Prime Minister? And they all go, make sure no one was homeless, make sure the fishies are okay, I'd replant all of the trees and make sure the animals are all good. And it's so interesting when you put these basic premises to adults, particularly adults who occupy positions of power in Parliament, that they just go, that's impossible, couldn't possibly done. And I'm like, but you're in charge. We make the rules. These rules are made up, and we see that every single day. You can make the rules that make people's lives worse, or you can make the rules that make people's lives better. Why would we not do that? So I guess not only is it important for people to know that politics belongs to those who turn up, it's also really important that they actually are looking at the evidence upon which politicians are saying the things that they are saying, and not taking their cues on what is possible in the world from the people who are laughing their way to the bank, ripping all of us off. And then I think, particularly in the context of this government's move to actively disenfranchise people, like it's kind of mask off voter suppression, because Minister Goldsmith told everybody that the reason that he needed everybody enrolled prior to the election and not being able to enrol and vote on the same day was in order to speed up the process of counting. Then we then had the Electoral Commission in front of Select Committee who said, that's not quite true at all. So it's not about that at all. But the government is not going to allow people to enrol and vote on the same day anymore. So people need to be enrolled. And this actually is a really critical point with the risk of a snap election. If there is a change of national leadership, don't leave it to the last minute. Go to, I think it's enroll.nz. God, that's embarrassing if I get that wrong. Enroll.nz, or Google enroll to vote. And make sure that your details are up to date. Don't leave it to chance. And I just make the point to people, your boss is voting, your landlord is voting, Mike Hosking is voting. Please vote.
So everybody, thank you very much, Chloe, for your time today. It's very valuable. Remember to vote. For goodness sake, get out there, check your enrolment and vote. We're going to make this a one-term government if that's the last thing we do. Thank you very much, Chloe, and all power to you for the election.
Kia ora. Thanks so much for having me, Hoa.
Welcome to G News, the good news.
Yeah.